The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello and welcome to The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, we look at contemporary public sculpture as debate has raged about various works in recent weeks. Who is public art for, and why does it continue to provoke such strong reactions? I talked to Louisa Buck, the art newspaper's contemporary art correspondent, and James Lingwood from the visionary producers of public works Artangel about public art, and the artist Olaf Breuning tells us about a work he's made for a hospital in Miami. And for this episode's Work of the Week, the artist Tom Sachs talks about Mondrian's Broadway Boogie-Woogie. Before all that, as the holidays get closer, why not give your nearest and dearest a gift subscription to the art newspaper? You can save up to 40% when you buy a subscription for a friend, colleague, or indeed for yourself. Choose between the digital-only subscription, full and immediate access to our website and app, or the complete subscription, all the benefits of the digital-only subscription, plus the monthly printed newspaper, delivered direct to your door. If you buy before the 10th of December, you can start the subscription with the January edition. Go to theartnewspaper.com and click on the subscribe link at the top left of the page. Now, recently on theartnewspaper.com, many of the big stories have been about public contemporary art. There was a storm about Maggi Hambling's sculpture dedicated to Mary Wollstonecraft in London. There's a constantly moving story about a shiny geometric monolith in the Utah desert that some say is a work by the artist John McCracken, and another similarly mysterious work in Romania. And in Venice, Italy, there's another furore about a work by the Swiss artist Christoph Büchel that was the most controversial work at the Venice Biennale in 2019. Barca Nostra was a rusting fishing boat which sank in the Mediterranean in 2015 with an estimated 800 to 1,100 migrants from Libya on board. Only 28 survived. Büchel took the boat to the Arsenale in Venice in 2019 and it's still there and now the subject of a dispute between him and the Biennale. I talked to Louisa Buck about this work and Büchel's work in general before James Lingwood, the director of Artangel, joined us to talk more about public art, its purpose and its audiences. Louisa, when I look back over the artnewspaper.com archive in relation to Christoph Büchel, what I found was a lot of fierce debates mentioned in the articles about him, often involving authorities as well as art world people. He wants to create this kind of controversy, doesn't he? So tell us about this latest controversy and why is it such a controversy?
Well, it starts off back at the Venice Biennale in 2019 when we were all of us walking through the Arsenale and there was a vast rusting boat on the quayside. Now, in a water dock, that's not an unusual thing to see. So it looked kind of weirdly at home amongst all the other sort of naval paraphernalia around in the Arsenale. But then, of course, there was no notice, nothing to identify it. If you were feeling diligent, you looked it up in the catalogue. But, you know, it was very mysterious. But, of course, word of mouth soon came through that this was indeed an artwork, not a piece of rusting boat left over by the Navy. It was Barca Nostra, it was called, and it was actually the very boat which had been leaving Libya for Italy, laden with well in excess, we don't know how many, of 1,000 immigrants trying to get to Italy. It collided with a Portuguese freighter, got into trouble and sank, killing everybody pretty much on board. I mean, it was an absolute, atrocity/disaster. The boat was then taken by the Italian Navy to Sicily, where there was an incredible, detailed forensic investigation on all of the bodies of the victims, many of whom were trapped in the hull of the boat. They'd been packed in. It was a trafficking boat. It was a horrific scenario. There was a forensic, detailed investigation as to who the identity of these people were. Many of their families were traced, and so they learned of the terrible fate of their relatives. Now, I don't quite know how this happened, but then time passes from 2015. Somehow, a deal is struck with the Sicilian town of Augusta, where this boat had ended up in a naval base, to bring it to the Venice Biennale as an exhibit. Christoph Büchel had signed a contract with the town of Augusta that he could borrow the boat for a year. It would be exhibited at the Venice Biennale, and then he would return it a year later. So the boat's there. Everybody feels extremely conflicted about this. Some people said it was a brilliant idea, that it shows how decadent the art world is, how decadent our world is, how uncaring we are. It was kind of appalling, I felt, that the boat was parked right by the cafe. So you sat swigging your Aperols and your cappuccinos, perhaps not knowing there was, in effect, the sight of a mass atrocity, a mass grave right beside you. So was it making us think about our place in the world, our uncaring thought about, crises unfolding very close to us? Or was it an exploitative, opportunistic, attention-seeking, profile-raising artwork by Christoph Büchel? And as you say, he does have form in this respect. He's done other things. He's crash-landed a mosque in Venice, inside a Catholic church for another Biennale, for the Icelandic Pavilion several years ago. He also set up community centres. He's done controversial other things in Tasmania we'll probably talk about in a minute. But this was a big one. And yes, it's very raw, and the debate and the controversy still rages.
But the latest part of this debate is that a year on from the Biennale, the boat is still there, and there's a dispute between the Biennale organisation and Büchel and his gallery.
Well, absolutely, yes, because as I said, he signed a deal with the Sicilian town of Augusta. Maybe money exchanged hands, I don't know. But anyway, the deal was that the boat would then come back to Augusta, where apparently it was intended to be the centrepiece for a memorial park, with the consent of the relatives. Also, in all the kind of rumblings around at the time of the Biennale, it was stated that apparently the families had given their permission for this boat to be used, or some families had given their permission. I mean, God knows, what the specifics are, but there were talk of permission. But now there's the boat. The Biennale now say that they have been hassling Büchel since November last year to bring this boat back and to honour his agreement, to honour the contract with the Sicilian town of Augusta. Augusta is saying they want the boat back as well. Now, sources close to Büchel say that, because he never talks to the press, which is another thing we can talk about in a minute, they say that apparently the boat was damaged in transit coming to Venice, so it's going to be impossible until the cradle that supports it is fixed for it to come back again to Augusta. So Büchel is now trying to get insurance to pay for this, either from the Biennale, who said no, go away, or probably rather more rudely, or indeed from the shipping company. But I mean, I would say that, all the ethics about whether you actually show it in a Biennale or not, I felt squeamish. I think where dead people are concerned, it starts to get very problematic. But anyway, all those ethics to one side, you honour the agreement to the families. You honour the agreement to the place from whence you lent it. And if the cradle got damaged, well, you cough up and pay for it, or you make your gallery, who are Hauser and Wirth, who are not short of a penny or two, to cough up and pay for it. I draw lines, moral lines in the sand, whatever one feels about artworks, raising profile of terrible crises. Apparently there was talk about him taking the boat to Brussels to show how the EU have been ignoring the immigration crisis. I mean, lofty motives, but, this is a place where, over 1,000 people died. I think you've got to be delicate to what their families want and what those needs are.
So let's talk a bit more broadly about Büchel, because I think this is the reason that we wanted to talk about this is because he's such an interesting artist when it comes to the public domain, because actually the public reaction, the critical reaction, the storms, the furores around these works are as much part of the work as the sort of objects that prompt all this reaction. So in a way, it is the kind of archetypal public art for the 21st century to a certain extent, isn't it?
Well, that's what he says. He says it's not the object, it's the journey, it's the process. Well, when you're in Tasmania and you set up a fake genetic testing for the local people saying, are you of Aboriginal descent? Or when you put the Barca Nostra, this boat where many people died, in the middle of a high-end art event, or when you several years before, put a mosque inside a Catholic church in Venice, right by the Jewish ghetto. You're being very provocative. And I think, yes, you are inciting debate, but what happens is that he comes and makes all this flurry, refuses to speak to the press, parachutes in, does this, and then off he goes, and you have In the case of Tasmania, the local Aboriginal people were extremely offended by the fact they were being objectified as these kind of tokens of, colonialism and with this fake genetic testing. I mean, yes, it was a very punchy point, but, they were very offended. So actually that particular aspect of his project was shut down. There was a lot of offence again about the mosque and, protests. And although the Muslim community were very happy, the Catholic Church wasn't. But, where was Büchel where all this was around? Was he up there defending it? No, he'd pushed off to plan his next project, and the curators had to deal with it. And, arguably also with Venice, where is he? He's not talking to the press. Maybe he's working behind the scenes to get it back. The families want a memorial park. They don't want their boat to be sitting there forever, rusting away in the Arsenale. So I think it's problematic. Yes, of course it's been provocative work. It's politically punchy work. It does draw attention to, all sorts of really major issues, but I think the way he does it is very self-serving and I would say quite narcissistic.
I think a key aspect of Büchel's work, and I've struggled with aspects of his work too, is that he takes a morally ambiguous position in issues where moral ambiguity is not called for in any sense. I mean, I think with the project where he claimed those prototypes for Trump's border wall as pieces of land art that could, and organised tours to go and see them, and we've seen the abuses of migrants to the United States on the US-Mexico border. And it to me, that left profound distaste in my mouth because, again, Büchel was absent from that project, as a sort of figurehead, and wouldn't come out and address the actual issues that the work conjured. And I think it's very easy. And in fact, I wonder if you've seen that piece of writing from, I think her name is Elizabeth Pearce, who's the writer for Mona in Tasmania, where she said that him disappearing after he'd set up that project in Tasmania was itself a sort of colonial kind of response. There he goes, back to Europe and leaves them with all this damage.
Well, this is it. I mean, I think, it's actually rather interesting to have the prototypes of Trump's appalling xenophobic wall. I mean, there it is. These great, big, high, extraordinary monoliths. There's an argument to be made about framing them, discussing them, having them as a symbol, a lightning rod for discussion. There's also a conversation to be had, if indeed the families did agree to have Barca Nostra put in the Venice Biennale, with, I really would say, a label saying what it is, so you're not just tipping your Aperols over it. There's an argument to that. But absolutely, yes, I think, the fact that he just hightails it off. I mean, these things are morally problematic. They are ambiguous. The whole issue around these kinds of projects are highly problematic. So he has to stand up, to my mind, and be counted and talk about it and engage with the Aboriginal people, talk about how they feel about this faux genetic testing, have a conversation, broaden it out. But, I think it's the arrogance of the artist, assuming that the artist is above this kind of, getting down with grassroots. He set up a Piccadilly Community Centre in the centre in Piccadilly Circus in the Hauser and Wirth Gallery. People came in to these community projects. So you had kind of poor people in a community centre, brilliantly recreated, going about, having sort of meetings, coffees, addiction therapy, all different kinds of things in the centre of Piccadilly. Zumba lessons and all that kind of thing, in the middle of Piccadilly. Now, you could argue that those people were being objectified. It was objectifying poor people as part of a kind of performative art project that was masquerading as a community centre. But I would argue those people, yes, it was very problematic, but people could do it with their consent. It's when you start doing stuff with dead people's families, you've got to be very careful about how you pitch it. And I think, it's really interesting what he does, but I think that he does take an intellectually lazy kind of cop-out by leaving other people to actually deal with the hardcore consequences. You can't just say it's the journey. You have to actually be part of that journey yourself as the artist.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, and also interesting because the community centre in Piccadilly was the first piece that I saw of his work, and I sort of got his sardonic message, and I appreciated it because we just elected a government in Britain at that time that was talking about a big society, but was also embarking on a programme of austerity that was anything but a big society, and so I kind of enjoyed that sardonic effect. But the more and more I've seen of Büchel's work, in a way, the more problematic his work has become to me, and I think you and I are both very much on artists' sides, aren't we? We believe in artists and we believe in their integrity. But Büchel definitely confounds me on that point. I find myself really struggling to defend him, where I would normally reach to defend artists in a more general sense.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I would, argue for the right for any artist to make artwork and comment about whatever they choose, even if I find that profoundly distasteful. I would even say, getting poor people in to have their, drug therapy or their Zumba class or their coffee morning or whatever in the middle of Piccadilly, being objectified in this way, provided they were in the full knowledge of what was happening and that it was part of an artwork, and it was part of an artwork about sardonically broken Britain and about the kind of rank hypocrisy that pervades capitalist society, the market economy. And indeed, even if the families had agreed to have Barca Nostra toured around, there was some talk about him wanting to sail it back as an activist. But, you can be an artist activist by all means, but, you've got to pick your targets. You cannot exploit people. You cannot exploit people who are in no position to actually give a comment one way or the other. And even if the work's problematic, I don't mind that. But I do think that, he is being very cowardly in this respect and actually not facing the consequences. I mean, I know that artists don't have to do PR for their work either. Why should they? The artwork should stand for itself. But when the artwork is so concerned with communicating, reaching out, providing heated debate and controversy, you can't just go, oops, sorry, I've done it now, I'm part of the process, goodbye. You have to, I think, take some responsibility.
Now, joining us now is James Lingwood from Artangel, and he has been involved in quite a few controversial projects, not least House by Rachel Whiteread and others. So James is going to join us now to talk about this issue a bit more widely. James, I wonder if you have any thoughts on the latest developments in the Christoph Büchel story.
Well, I think it just suggests that context is everything, really. I'd sort of forgotten about it, like most of us had, over the past year, and I didn't even know it was just sitting as a hulk, as a sculptural hulk in Venice still. But it reminded me of another sculptural project, not really proposed as it was initially proposed as a public art project, which was Jeremy Deller's Baghdad car bomb, which actually also, I mean, it was as you know, it was a car bomb which went off in a book market in Baghdad, and Jeremy's initial proposal was for it to be situated on the fourth plinth. And then it wasn't awarded that commission, but then it found a home in the Imperial War Museum, amongst all sorts of other weaponry involved in killing people. And, it seemed to me, and I think to many other, viewers, like to be a really interesting, thought-provoking, but not sort of superficially provocative way of doing it. But of course, it was something which involved a lot of people being killed.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, he toured that around America as well as a public art project, didn't
initially,
he?
That's right,
yeah. And again, so, and one of the key things about Büchel that we've just been discussing is that Büchel is not visually present as part of the projects. He allows the projects to happen and then stands back, whereas Jeremy Deller, in the case of that work, was fundamental to its delivery. He was there with that sculpture as it toured America. And I wonder if that, do you think that's part of it, Louisa, that in a way Jeremy was accountable for that work in a sense?
I think it's absolutely crucial. I completely agree with James. Context is absolutely is everything. And I think that Jeremy toured it round, I mean, very bravely actually, on a flatbed truck all round America with a member of the American military, with somebody who'd been there on the spot, a local witness as well. So you had all that, and then he actually donated the piece. He'd paid for it to be shipped back from Baghdad, and then he donated it, gave it to the Imperial War Museums. He didn't make any money out of it, and he was very present, not as somebody as a kind of apologist, but somebody who was happy to engage with all the different debates, with various kind of Iraqi people, with American military, with pacifists, with people who are pro the military, and he was there as the artist, taking responsibility for this project.
No, that's absolutely true. It's like not just the context, but in that case, the conversation made it a kind of morally viable proposition.
Whereas Büchel, can I just say, the thing about Büchel was he refused to let the Biennale authorities put a label even by Barca Nostra. I mean, he christened it, gave it the title as well. You could only read about it in the catalogues. It meant that you actually had to buy the catalogue, look it up and see it. So being willfully obscure, it seemed to me, for some sort of weird purist motivation that was his alone. So, yeah, he wasn't having that conversation.
One of the things it exposes, James, is this there's a sort of variety of all sorts of contracts, some written and very official, and then some verbal or otherwise. Just there's all sorts of relationships that come into question when you do a public art project, right? And the process of negotiation is very, very complex. So can you say something about that? Because a lot of your job must be dealing with that kind of stuff. Would that be fair?
Well, actually, not that much of my job is really involved with dealing with this kind of public art, strange enough. So, and even then, you kind of often involved engaging whether you want to be working by stealth, and sometimes that can be interesting, or working through consensus. I think the proposition becomes always more important when the work is intended to be in a place for quite a long period of time. So, there's more kind of latitude when you're involved in temporary installations or interventions, and much less so when they're meant to be long-term or permanent. And then there's a whole range of, not just contractual stuff, but, trying to sort of draw together a kind of, like to sort of build a kind of microclimate around the project, which enables it to be possible.
Yeah. I'm really interested in the foundations of your involvement with Artangel, because it seems to me that Artangel is almost an anti-public sculpture organisation to a certain degree, because precisely what you're saying, that on the one hand it's the sort of temporary projects, but also it's how you, in a way, you don't do conventional public sculptural projects. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think we, probably this was thinking that we had, 2 or 3 decades ago, where, we felt that the possibility, for enabling artists to make really interesting work outside of the gallery spaces was so circumscribed by the constraints placed on it by permanent commissioning that we just thought, let's take a step to the side. Let's not think about permanence. Let's not think about permission always. And let's think about making things happen and then engaging with responses as and after they'd happen. I think that the context has shifted quite a bit, and I think the imperatives to really engage thoughtfully with communities of interest are now much stronger than they probably were like a couple of decades ago. A fairly obvious sort of reference point, but when we were involved with commissioning Rachel Whiteread's house, actually we did have to get permissions from local neighbourhood groups and against gritted teeth from the local council and others. But there was a sort of sense that was as far as we needed to go, which was to get the permissions, and a kind of nervousness about going further than that in case we kind of met hostility in a way that would have made the realisation of the work impossible.
But I remember at the time how extraordinary it was that, because I remember covering it for the radio, how extraordinary it was that now such a kind of classic, the cast, the mould cast of the inside of a house in a public space, this beautiful sort of monolith that appeared, caused so much fury and anger. There were questions in the house, and it was only ever going to be temporary anyway, James, wasn't it? So it wasn't like it was going to be there forever. But I look back now and, it seems classical and beautiful, like a cenotaph, and the fact that it caused so much fury and so much anger, the world has changed a lot in the way it views public sculpture, it seems to me.
Well, it's certainly true that when you look at it now, you just see this very quiet, mute memorial, and it's hard to imagine, as you say, the sound and fury, which, was just like a lightning conductor, wasn't it? But what I wanted to refer to, just to pick up on this kind of engagement with communities of interest, was a project which Artangel was in the process of making with Mike Nelson. And I don't think Mike will mind me talking about it, although it was a painful experience. This was a project which had been intended, a sort of remodelling of one of the blocks of housing on the Haygate estate. And for listeners who are in London, will know that the Haygate estate is an extremely contested issue. It was a very large post-war area of social housing, which was condemned by the council and then scheduled for redevelopment, and with some really awful stories about how some of the people living there were decanted to housing quite a long way away from Elephant and Castle. And Mike had a proposal which we secured agreement with from the council and also from the new developers to remodel one of the blocks into a sculpture.
It's a giant mountain, wasn't it? It'd be a great giant ziggurat of rubble, wasn't it?
It was a ziggurat, inside of which there would have been playing some sort of film of the demolition and the construction of the work, and maybe more as well. So it kind of doubled up. And in a way, at least partly, it was, I think, intended as a memorial to a certain period of social housing, which maybe in a time will become every bit as mysterious as more ancient ziggurat structures. But although we had a level of engagement with representatives of the local community, we didn't work that through successfully. I don't know how we could have. And in a sense, their hostility to the project, as it was beginning to happen, we were on site, then kind of made the council withdraw their permission because it had become already too contentious. Now, obviously we're interested in works of art which have the capacity to be contentious. I mean, it's not like you're trying to form a consensus immediately. But sometimes if the contention happens before the work is actually realised, it can kill it dead.
But it's really interesting, that project, isn't it? Because I'm pleased you raised it, because all three of us know Mike and know that his intentions in terms of that project were utterly honourable and considering those communities, but also because there is such a fraught relationship at the moment between community, between development, between different constituencies involved in that project. In a way, the tension was so high, and after all, you look at the arguments against that project, and it's all about people's lives and people's lives being uprooted and destroyed by rampant development in London.
But it was and the fact that those estates were being destroyed, which is what people didn't want to happen. So to make a memorial, an artwork out of basically the fabric of their lives, generations sometimes, that had been destroyed, was so raw, wasn't it? It was so raw and so terrible that it would be almost excruciating, I think, for the people whose houses would have made up part of that sculpture.
And all of this brings into question about public art and public sculpture's relationship with community. And I'm intrigued, for instance, by talking about a very different kind of project, which is this Maggi Hambling sculpture, which appeared in Newington Green in London and created an enormous stir recently on social media. And it's a work that went through all sorts of processes, and even there was a public vote, and there was a committee, and a competition, and all sorts of things. But it again confirmed that when we talk about public sculpture, we're talking about, yes, the immediate communities, but also wider communities, And there was a strong reaction, for instance, from certain feminist commentators that felt that it misrepresented Mary Wollstonecraft. So I suppose what I'm getting at is public sculpture and public art has this capacity to inflame in a way that often art in museum just simply can't. James, do you want to say something?
Yes, it does have that capacity to inflame. And people are very quick to draw judgment on works which somehow kind of they feel are on their territory, either in terms of subject matter or locality, in a way that just simply wouldn't happen. I mean, if that work had been presented in a gallery space in North London, people would have just said, well, that's a really wonderful sculpture, or that's not a very wonderful sculpture. And would have left it at that. So it was just simply the matter of, again, where it was placed, which seems to have caused a lot of offence.
Well, and the aspect of permanence as well. I think that comes into play too. I mean, whether one thinks it's, an appalling piece of kitsch or a wonderful piece of female affirmation, if it was going to be there for a year or 6 months, or its departure was always written into its existence, then that would have a very different kind of response, I think, to the fact that, to all intents and purposes, whatever permanent means, it was intended to be there in perpetuity.
I wonder also about one of the things it seems to me that people have been interested in that context, and also in the context of Marc Quinn installing by stealth a sculpture of a Black Lives Matter protester on the empty plinth vacated by the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol is that very many of the voices against it said, who asked this person to speak for us? And certainly in the case of Marc Quinn, it was a very self-appointed and many of us would argue very pompous attitude that so he was going to speak. He was going to be the sculptor that spoke for the post-Edward Colston era in Bristol. And of course, there was a really significant reaction to that. But again, with public sculpture, it's how is it that a particular voice ends up speaking for that community or representing a particular person? Louisa?
It's incredibly complex. And again, it brings into play the whole notion of the artist's ego. And I bring Christoph Büchel shoulder to shoulder with Marc Quinn here, where I think artists sometimes just lose the plot. They get so... I think, Quinn thought he was doing something really honourable and helpful. He'd worked with the woman who was depicted in the work, and he felt that he was doing something, really helpful. It was kind of so way off the mark. Maggi Hambling, likewise. You've got to be very careful producing images of naked women in public sculpture these days, even if it's by another woman. It's you've got to think about this stuff a bit. I'm not saying you should self-censor, but I think you've got to be thoughtful about your intent and these different kinds of aspects of what you're doing. And public sculpture, yes, it speaks for many voices. People feel tremendous ownership. I mean, Edward Colston, that sculpture should have been addressed, decades ago. We know this, and the fact it hadn't been was why it got toppled, and it's going to end up now in a museum, not still bedaubed and prone, and not in a public place. And James is quite right. It takes a lot of the heat off if something's put framed in the museum and in that kind of context. Museums are still public, but it's a different kind of public. It's not the fabric of people's lives. It's not dealing with the stuff of their existence and them having this kind of very particular relationship when it's out in the world.
James, I wondered if you could say something about that, about embedding artists in a community or somehow prompting the engagement between an artist and a space.
Yeah, I mean, in the particular case of the Marc Quinn sculpture in Bristol, I mean, it's just really hard to disentangle what Louisa's kindly saying is an honourable motive from opportunism, really.
Well, I think it probably was opportunistic,
and, in such a highly charged and loaded space, you can't just pile in and put something there. I mean, something like that probably does need a more measured approach to kind of have different kinds of proposals, maybe some temporary ideas, some ways of framing them on it. I mean, one of my favourite ongoing acts of dissidence in relation to public sculpture is the sculpture outside Glasgow Museum of Modern Art, which almost always has a transport cone on its head, but no one bothers. The council don't bother to take it off. It's kind of publicly condoned dissidence in a way.
Well, we've seen an awful lot of face masks on public sculptures during the pandemic. And I like the fact that Maggi Hambling's Mary Wollstonecraft has had a T-shirt put onto her. And Anthony Gormley's Angel of the North is endlessly getting sort of tampered with. In fact, I remember Anthony Gormley also in Londonderry, doing a project with you where actually the sculptures got necklaced. They had tyres put round their necks, which, to my mind, gave them a potency and a power and an impact which was way beyond their original state.
Just to go back to Bristol, I mean, I think the best proposal that came out very quickly afterwards was Banksy's idea for the Colston statue, which was simply to shift it so it was memorialised as a statue in the process of being toppled, to freeze that moment, which actually I think would have been really great. So.
Does that mean are you likely to be contacting Mr. Banksy and to realise that project?
I don't think Banksy needs Artangel. We did try and contact him about 20 years ago, but weren't very successful. So.
But I also think what would be so good for that Colston site would be for rotating sculptures and works by artists of all different inclinations, desires, communities, and have that sense of it being a sense of spectrum. I think I'm a bit squeamish about permanence these days. I mean, maybe Colston on the tilt would be a great idea, but it's just unfortunate that it's Banksy, who's also very opportunistic in many respects, who proposed it. I think, but the whole idea of artists like Quinn, I mean, I think it was an utterly opportunistic thing to do. I think artists have to be very careful about when they're working in the public realm. You don't want to get diluted in something completely bland and meaningless, but also there has to be sensitivity to communities and community thoughts and agendas and intentions.
I mean, there's been some interesting work done in relation to memorials and sculptures from the fascist era in Germany, Italy. I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the artist, but where a sort of fascist memorial was reframed and, as it were, retuned, given a contemporary voice, but without erasing what had been there before, which seems to me to be a very neat way of addressing some of these deep traumas, if you can do it well.
Or allowing other artists to mess with the work. I'm thinking of Hugh Locke also, the British artist who has had a long history of wonderfully messing with colonial Columbus sculpture, the Coulston sculpture, adorning them with cowrie shells, the kind of currency of slavery, or, extraordinary ritualistic costumes. So he's in putting his voice and other voices onto these sculptures and reframing them and redefining them. So I think, artists being allowed to mess with sculpture as well is another way of making this kind of thing, fresh and have proper relevance and meaning.
To conclude, I feel like we could talk about this subject forever, but I wonder, actually, so much of our discussion here today has been about positioning and voices and the amplification of those voices, because of course James, you will know better than anyone, you want to work with an artist, you have to allow them the freedom to engage with the space and the freedom to express themselves, but also they are going to naturally meet other forces which they need to be respectful of, and that seems to me to be an extraordinarily fine balance.
It is, and it's a complex navigation or negotiation through various constraints, through various interests. I think this is where sometimes the job of an artist involves not only the kind of conceptualizing of a sculpture, let's say, but also it's about negotiating the process. I dare say that's often been the case historically. I don't think we should just assume that this is a kind of a contemporary challenge only.
A final word from you, Louisa.
One of my all-time favourite works was Marc Wallinger's Ecce Homo, the first work for the fourth plinth, which was a human-sized cast of a man on the plinth, naked. You couldn't really tell what race he was. You couldn't tell really what he was. Quite contemporary. Had a wreath of barbed wire around his head. He looked puny, insignificant, but incredibly powerful on that plinth. Christians loved it. Atheists loved it. It was a really powerful piece because it acted as a lightning rod for all different kinds of thoughts. It was a wonderful anti-monumental monument. It
was about vulnerability rather than power. And it was very perfectly poised, conceptually and physically, on the edge of the plinth.
Well, how nice to end on discussing a work that we all love. Thank you, James. Thank you, Louisa. This has been really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Nice to see you both.
You can read Christina Ruiz's report on the Büchel row on our website or on our app for iOS, which you can get from the App Store. If you'd like to read more about Artangel's current and past projects, go to artangel.org.uk. We'll talk to Olaf Breuning about his project in Miami in a moment, but first, here are some of the top stories, other than those about public art, on the Art Newspaper's website this week. The Tate has announced plans to reduce its workforce by 12%, equivalent to around 120 full-time roles due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The institution has subsequently launched a voluntary redundancy scheme in all departments and at all levels to save the £4.8 million required to survive the crisis, according to senior museum management. Workers willing to take voluntary redundancy or consider early retirement, reduced working hours or a career break are encouraged to take up the offer, but compulsory redundancies could follow if the museum group fails to save enough. Earlier this year, 313 redundancies were announced across Tate Enterprises, which operates retail, catering and publishing services at the four Tate galleries in London, Liverpool and St Ives. The Cuban activist and artist Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara is in a critical condition after going on hunger strike for more than 7 days. The hunger strike began as part of an escalating row over alleged human rights abuses by Cuban state security. Otero Alcántara is a member of an art collective known as the San Isidro Movement, which has been campaigning against the arrest and imprisonment of 2 rappers, Didier Almagro and Dennis Solis Gonzalez. The latter received an 8-month prison sentence for confronting a police officer who entered his home without a warrant. And finally, Irina Alexandrovna Antonova, the president of the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, died this week at the age of 98. Russian news agencies reported that she died of coronavirus in addition to heart disease. Her life at the museum spanned the second half of the 20th century, beginning in 1945 under Joseph Stalin, before she was appointed director in 1961, a position that she held remarkably until 2013. You can read these stories and much more at theartnewspaper.com or on the app. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. This holiday season, Christie's is the destination for luxury. From a 43.1 carat cashmere sapphire and a pink gold Patek Philippe reference 3800 to an Hermes diamond Himalaya Birkin, the highlights from the live and online auctions range from rare and unique to the extraordinary. To view the works in person, Christie's welcomes you by appointment beginning this week at their galleries in the heart of Rockefeller Center. In the meantime, browse the sales online and explore related features at christies.com/luxury. Before we go on, do make sure you catch up with a new series of our other podcast, A Brush With, in which I have in-depth conversations with artists about their influences and cultural experiences. The first episode of this second series, A Brush With Ragnar Kjartansson, is out now. Subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're currently listening. Now, the New York-based Swiss-born artist Olaf Breuning has just finished installing the interactive sculpture The Cat at the Christine E. Lynn Rehabilitation Center in Miami. The $400,000 public artwork was created through the city's Art in Public Places program and funded using a percentage of the project's taxpayer-backed construction costs. The large concrete work features a face based on Paul Klee's 1922 painting Head of a Man Going Senile, a regular motif in Breuning's art, as well as moving elements that can be manipulated by patients as part of their physical therapy, or by any curious passers-by. The work's being unveiled officially on the 5th of December as part of Miami Art Week. Our Americas editor Helen Stoyless spoke to Olaf about the work.
So how did you go about creating this work? Why did you want to make it a work that people would use in their therapy?
It's of course, it was always from the beginning on clear it is in front of a rehabilitation center. I felt it makes sense to do something what pleases me aesthetically, but also maybe helps people to do small exercises. If they do it or not, I don't know. But even if they wouldn't do it, it just looks good. But if they do it, then it would be a kind of both thing, motivation served, like my aesthetical and the one for the people getting better.
So it's got these kinds of poles on it with weights that can be moved up and down, and it seems like it has circular pieces that you turn, I'm assuming, from photos. How did you come up with these elements? Was that working with physical therapists, with doctors to figure out what kinds of tools would be good to add to it?
Yes. So I focused really on, of course, on very small movements, not like that someone has like a treadmill or something or like a full body exercise. So they're like mostly like, for the hands or for the arms or shoulders, small things. So I came up with an idea, and then I went back and forth with 2 specialists at the hospital, and they finally approved it and said that's good. Then I got the green light to produce it like this, because I'm not a doctor, of course, so I cannot. But I was good. I think my first approach to it was very good. So I kind of proud that I came up with an idea what they liked.
And has it been kind of tested out by patients yet? Have you had any feedback about it being used by anyone as part of their physical therapy?
Well, would you ask me another time? Maybe, but I think during Corona, I don't think people like to touch unnecessary objects other people touch, so I'm not sure. And I think Miami didn't have such a good last few months neither, so I don't think it was probably used a lot. But it will be. It
will be, and it's going to be open this week, is that right? And then it'll be kind of available to the public as well as to patients at the rehab center. And Can you talk a little bit aesthetically about the work, the inspiration of the Paul Klee painting, why you decided to do it as a cat? What was your kind of thinking behind the entire kind of like form of it?
Well, I try to repeat certain elements in my art through the time, and the Paul Klee face is really a simple connection. I mean, I grew up with that painting at home, not the original, just a poster. But this kind of was engraved in my brain since I was like a child. And I always, when I saw that painting, I thought like, oh, that face is so appealing to me. Like many things we find appealing experienced in our past, out of what reason ever. But so this was just for me something I felt connected to. And then I started to do 2008, the first sculpture where I would use that face. And that was also in Miami Beach. During the Art Basel Art Fair, I did an enormous big sand sculpture. It's like, I don't know how many tons of sand. And this was not a cat, it was a large breast woman lying on the beach with that face. And then I used the face another time in Zurich for a sculpture called The Animal, what is kind of close to the cat, could be a brother or sister of this sculpture. And then I used it a third time here in Miami, and I might use it in future in another occasion. Just something what maybe when someone is interested in 10, 20, 30 years about my work can look back and think, oh yeah, that came up there and there and there, and it would have a small timeline in it. Yeah, just I use stuff because I love them, and I always loved the Paul Klee, his work in general, but then also like that specific painting.
And as an artist, what's the appeal of doing public art? You said you've done other public sculptures, including in Miami. What is it about doing these kinds of large public works that appeals? And is there anything that kind of doesn't appeal? Do you ever get any kind of blowback from some of your works or criticism? Or
first of all, I don't really react heavily to criticism. I always assume that 7 billion voices or 8 billion soon voices on the planet. I mean, I couldn't care less about people not liking something. So long I like it, I'm happy, and the people I work with like it, that's good. But the other thing is, as an artist, when you want to make large-scale sculptures, you need a lot of funding. And I did in my past a few things outside of public art where the galleries or myself would put money into it, but I think the budget of public art is really attractive to make bigger things. And that's not a motivation of me. I'm not an artist who want to make bigger and bigger things. But since I work on so many levels, from very fragile drawings to big sculptures, I sometimes just really enjoy to have another thinking about making an artwork, to have to be able to work with tons of concrete and like just this is a different approach, what is really refreshing. And I think the only downside on public art is not the criticism of positive criticism, is more like you don't have the 100% freedom you have as an artist when you do your work in your studio. So you have a lot of people included giving their opinions and comments and regulations, and that sometimes can be rather a challenge. But in Miami, this was a very good experience. Sometimes it's more difficult, sometimes it's easier.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing this work when I'm in Miami next. Thank you, Olaf. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
No problem. It was a pleasure.
You can see the cat at the Christine E. Lynn Rehabilitation Centre in Miami from this Saturday. Now it's time for the work of the week. The artist Tom Sachs currently has an exhibition at Aquavella in New York, and he's chosen to talk to us about Piet Mondrian's Broadway Boogie-Woogie, part of the permanent collection at the city's Museum of Modern Art, which Sachs recreated using colourful strips of tape on plywood in the 1996 piece Victory Boogie-Woogie. To see an image of the work, go to theartnewspaper.com, click on the podcast tab and look for this episode.
Can you tell me a bit about why you chose that work? I know it's got a really early connection for you as an artist.
Well, I was kind of obsessed with the de Stijl movement when I was in college, and I was studying architecture and sculpture because like the Bauhaus, there was this Gesamtkunstwerk. They did everything. They did paintings, they did sculptures, they did furniture, they did obviously architecture and performance and stuff. But of the Die Stil movement, it was Rietveld and Mondrian who were the two dominant figures. And when I first moved to New York, half a dozen years later after I'd learned about this stuff, I opened my studio near Canal Street, and I really loved Mondrian. And around that time, there was this Museum of Modern Art retrospective, and I can't remember the exact year, but it was like the main Mondrian retrospective, and that's still the best Mondrian book is that catalog. It was 1995, and I thought to myself, I really want that painting, Broadway Boogie-Woogie, and it was the apotheosis of the show. There's one even better, actually, called Victory Boogie-Woogie, but it was unfinished. It was a lozenge-shaped. It's like the same thing, but diagonal. And you can see Victory Boogie-Woogie is really my favorite, just because it was the unfinishedness with little bits of tape made it special. But Broadway Boogie-Woogie is the last and most fully realized work. I think if he had lived longer, Victory could have been even better. It's like a shame. I feel like he was cut down right as he was like hitting his prime. But I love that painting, and I went to visit it a bunch of times, and I thought to myself, well, I'd love to have that in my life, but I don't think going down to Wall Street and organizing money would be an authentic use of my time, which is what it would take to get one of those. You'd have to spend a lot of time organizing funds so you could have one of those Mondrians in your house. And at the same time, my studio was near Canal Street, and there were a lot of fake Hermes bags and Gucci sunglasses, and I was really impressed with the quality of them. I mean, sure, they weren't as good as the $5 ones weren't as good as a $500 one, but the $5 ones, if you left the pair of $5 sunglasses behind the restaurant, you just move on with your day. If you left $500 sunglasses, you might be motivated to go back and see if they're still there. And I thought that those sunglasses own your ass, and there's an advantage to something that's $5. There's more freedom to it. So it was around that sort of realization about my consumerism and my addiction to status stuff helped me to go look at that Mondrian and make my own. But I wasn't interested in making a forgery, but a model. And so my Broadway Boogie-Woogie is not made of oil and canvas. It's made of gaffer's tape on plywood, and those are materials that I feel much closer to. If you could see behind me, this is just one of my 4 tape libraries in the studio.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is quite the tape collection you've got.
That's just the one in this room, but I've got a few more.
Lots of colors, the full rainbow.
That when I travel, I go to hardware stores, so I've got every color duct tape comes in. By the way, duct tape comes in every color except gold, and I think that's because duct tape represents America's intolerance for fine craftsmanship and for repair. Americans don't like to repair, so duct tape is like the minimal job. And in Europe, duct tape for many generations was called American tape, which is a duct tape for a couple dozen years has been called American tape. There's probably more to say about Victory Boogie-Woogie, and that's that once I started making my own Mondrians out of gaffer's tape and plywood, I started to opened up my consciousness to this idea of sympathetic magic. The idea is if you don't have something and you want it, do your best to make it as a way of accessing its power. Like a voodoo doll is a form of sympathetic magic, or an ex voto that you would pray to make part of your body heal. And in a lot of ways, making my own Broadway Boogie-Woogie helped me to become a fully realized artist, because I was making works of art that had a high degree of authenticity, in that it was really mine. Sure, it was Mondrian's composition, but I had found a way to make it my own. And if you go to see the show that's up right now at Aquavella Gallery, you'll see a dozen paintings that use that same basic strategy that I've been doing since 1991, which is to make the things that I want and find ways of making them real. Like the American flag is the ultimate symbol of power globally and terror. And it's a symbol of what I'm most proud of, the freedom of speech in America, and what I'm most ashamed of is institutionalized racism that is pernicious and persists to today, to other status icons of candy and the best ice maker and Air Force One and even the NASA icon, which is the sort of the most status brand name behind science. If you're going to label it, give a status, you'd put the NASA meatball on your van or your notebook or your brain.
Absolutely. And do you still have Victory Boogie-Woogie, your version? Do you still have that work?
I have a version of, is it called New York City 2 Unfinished, which is in that same very late, like last 3 paintings. I don't think I possess Victory Boogie-Woogie anymore, which is a shame. But the thing about being a maker is that it might start as desire for greedy consumerism, ambition for collecting things, but the love comes from the making, and the energy is in the moment that the thing is made. And even when you spend so much time studying, and I went to the Museum of the Modern Art so many times to look at Victory Boogie-Woogie, the pleasure of and the privilege of my role or my job as an artist is getting to spend time with things in the world and study them, understand them, and get inside the head of the maker. So in a way, as much as when I was making it or desire before I started to make it, I really wanted it. But once I finished, I kind of got it out of my system. And it's not important to me.
So you don't go visit anymore? It's still in MoMA, isn't it? I mean, it's still hanging in the galleries.
No. Oh, yeah. I mean, when I go see it, it's like, it's like rekindling an old flame or something. It's very romantic. But I meant that my version.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, my version of it in a way isn't. It is important, but in a way, it's like if I run into one of mine at the one that I made, it's also very romantic and exciting. It's probably more exciting, to be honest, to see one of mine. But I guess my point was only about physically possessing it. I'm extremely materialistic, but not possessive at all.
Thank you, Tom. I think that's a great note to end on.
Okay, cool.
Tom Sachs' Handmade Paintings is at Aquavella in New York until the 18th of December, and you can find out more about the Mondrian work at moma.org. And that's it for this episode. You can subscribe to the Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com. Click on the subscribe link at the top left of the page and you'll find a range of subscriptions. And do subscribe to this podcast and A Brush With if you haven't already done so. Please give us a rating or review if you've enjoyed it. You can also find us on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Mahauska, Amy Dawson and David Clack, and David is also the editor and sound designer. Thanks to Louisa and James, to Helen and Olaf, and to Tom. And thank you for listening. See you next week. Bye for now. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.